Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission really is to sift through a whole stack of sources and pull out the crucial bits, the surprising ideas, just for you.
And today, we're diving deep, like really deep, into some of humanity's biggest, most fundamental questions. We're looking at philosophy around God, the soul, the universe.
Yeah, these are the heavy hitters. And we're using a particular piece of material as our guide, something that really dissects concepts many of us just, well, take for granted.
It's about getting clear. What do you actually know? What do you just believe? And, maybe most interestingly, what does it mean to honestly say, I don't know? Get ready to think.
Okay, so let's get into it. We all ponder these things, don't we? Does God exist? Is there a soul? What is all this?
And this source material we're looking at, it starts right there. It acknowledges these are common questions for, well, pretty much everyone.
And it makes an interesting observation early on. When it comes to God specifically, people tend to fall into a few camps. They believe God exists, or they believe God doesn't exist.
Or they're in the third camp. They just don't know. They're unsure.
But here's the crucial distinction the source draws, and it's really central. The difference between knowing something and just believing it.
Right, because how many people, when you really press them, would say they know the answer with certainty? The source suggests probably very few. Most operate on belief.
That's the nub of it. For many, there's no definitive proof either way, and the speaker in our source material points out a subtle difference. Some people are aware they don't know.
While others maybe aren't even fully aware that what they hold is belief, not hard knowledge.
So the speaker aligns themselves with that don't know group, the agnostic position, basically. But they frame it, and this is important, not as simple ignorance, but as a type of knowledge.
Yeah, like knowing the limits of your own knowledge, knowing what you don't know.
It kind of echoes Socrates, doesn't it? I know that I know nothing, that famous line.
It does. And the source really hammers this point, saying, I don't have the answer isn't a weakness. It argues it actually takes honesty, maybe even a bit of courage.
Okay, so with that framework knowing versus believing, let's tackle the first big concept from metaphysics the source explores, God.
Right. And the material is quick to point out there isn't just one idea of God. People conceive of God in, well, vastly different ways.
You've got the personal idea, for instance, God as a being who, interacts with us, maybe is even visible in some way.
Then there's the flip side, the impersonal concept. God is more of a fundamental force, something unseen, perhaps abstract.
And even broader, like some see nature itself as divine, right?
Exactly, naturalistic views. Plus you have common attributes people assign, like omnipotence, God can do anything, and omniscience, God knows everything.
But this is where the source introduces a major philosophical hurdle, especially for that all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good picture of God. It's the classic problem of evil.
Yes. This is a really tough one, logically speaking. The argument, as the source lays it out, goes something like this. If God is omnipotent and omniscient and inherently good.
Then why is there evil? Why is there suffering in the world?
Precisely. The source uses a stark example, like a train accident. If God knew it would happen being omniscient and could have stopped it being omnipotent but didn't,
Then how does that fit with being perfectly good or kind?
it creates a real dilemma. The source explains it's often framed this way by atheists challenging theists in philosophical debates. Either God can't prevent evil, meaning not truly omnipotent.
Or God doesn't want to prevent it, which challenges the idea of God being purely good. It's a fundamental tension the source dives right into. Okay, moving from God, the next big concept the source tackles is the soul.
Belief in a soul, some kind of enduring spirit, is incredibly common, isn't it, across so many cultures.
Totally. Yet the source makes a simple but powerful point. Despite this widespread belief, nobody's actually, seen a soul.
Right. We have this feeling, this intuition maybe, that there's more to us than just flesh and bone, but defining it, proving it, that's where it gets tricky.
And the source reveals just how varied the ideas about the soul actually are, philosophically and religiously. It's not one single concept.
No, not at all. It mentions Jainism, for example,
Yeah.
where the soul is thought to have a physical size the same size as the body it occupies.
Wait, really? A physical size? So like if you grow or lose weight, the soul changes size too. That's unexpected.
It is. And it immediately raises those kinds of follow-up questions,
Yeah.
How does that work? Then other traditions, the source notes, think the soul is tiny, maybe atom-sized.
Or the complete opposite, that it has no size at all. It's purely non-physical.
Exactly. And then you have major traditions that reject the idea of a permanent soul altogether. Buddhism, for instance, talks about a stream of consciousness continuity, but not a fixed, unchanging soul.
And the source also brings in views that actively argue against the soul, like the ancient Indian Charvaka school and some Western materialist thinkers.
Yeah, they argue pretty forcefully, as presented in the source, that consciousness, thinking, it's all just a function of the physical body,
Mhm.
particularly the brain.
So the brain is just a very complex machine, and thinking is what it does. No need for a separate soul entity.
That's the gist of their argument. Nothing separate survives the body.
Okay, third big one, the universe. Where do we even start with that?
Well, the source defines it simply as, the totality of physical existence, everything there is.
But it makes the point that while we're in it, we haven't exactly seen it all, have we? We've seen pictures of Earth from space, maybe our galaxy schematically.
But the whole thing, from the outside, impossible to grasp, really. The scale is just mind-boggling.
So the fundamental questions become who made it or what made it? And maybe the even harder question the source highlights. Why? Why create it at all?
And that why question, the source argues, is where philosophical explanations often run into trouble. There's generally no fully adequate or logically satisfying answer given for the universe's ultimate purpose or reason for being.
So when people say things like, oh, it exists just because, or they use concepts like Leela, divine play, how does the source interpret those kinds of answers?
It suggests they're often, essentially, quite dignified ways of admitting we don't really know. They acknowledge the mystery rather than providing a concrete, rational explanation for the why.
Okay, and what about the what from? What was the universe made out of? That seems like another potential paradox.
It is, because if you say it was created from something pre-existing, well, then that something seems more fundamental than the creator, doesn't it? It existed before.
Which leads to this idea the source mentions, found in several major religions.
Creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing.
Right. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they have this concept. The source even brings up a line from a Sufi song, something about a time when nothing wasn't even there, which just shows how difficult it is to even think about absolute non-existence preceding existence.
It really bends the mind.
Now, this next part is fascinating because it connects these huge ideas back to, well, us, to our own experiences. The source looks at how we interpret things, using sleep paralysis as an example.
Yeah, that's something a lot of people can relate to, that weird feeling of waking up mentally but being physically stuck, unable to move, can be pretty freaky.
Definitely. And the source points out how this single physical event can get interpreted in completely different ways. Like, one interpretation is mystical.
Right, seeing it as God directly controlling you, maybe a sign you're close to the divine or something.
But then there's a totally different take, a psychological one. The source mentions Freud's idea, though. It's just one interpretation that it might stem from some conscious memories of being an embryo.
Like floating in the womb, sometimes getting tangled or stuck, unable to move freely. And it notes this tends to fade for most people by around age 30.
Wow. So same experience can't move while awake, but two massively different explanations. Divine touch versus, like, a memory echo from before birth.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates how our underlying beliefs, our framework, shapes how we make sense of things. The input's the same, the output depends on the lens.
And the source uses this to circle back to clarity. Be clear about the input and the output. If going to a temple makes you feel peaceful, the direct observation is just that. I go there, I feel peace.
Right. Don't necessarily leap to grand conclusions about the ultimate nature of reality based only on that feeling. The feeling is real, the interpretation is separate.
It reminds me of the analogy used about enjoying a bhajan, a religious song. You can totally dig the music, the rhythm, the vibes.
Even if you don't literally subscribe to the specific theology in the lyrics about God.
Yeah. It's like enjoying any song, right? The source mentions one about, 4 bottles of vodka? You can like the beat without actually endorsing, drinking 4 bottles of vodka.
Precisely. Appreciating the musicality is one thing. Believing or acting on the lyrical content is another. Separate the input-output.
So bringing this all together, the source loops back to that initial idea of agnosticism, but links it strongly to intellectual honesty.
It brings up Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, describes him as maybe the most honest thinker in Western philosophy, because after incredible amounts of deep, rigorous thought on God, the soul, the universe, his final conclusion was basically,
I don't know.
I don't know. But, and this is key as the source presents it, it wasn't a lazy I don't know. It was a hard-won, reasoned conclusion based on understanding the absolute limits of what human reason can definitively prove through analysis alone.
So it's about being honest about those limits, not pretending to know what we can't truly know for sure.
Yes. The source essentially argues that within metaphysics, if you're being truly honest and rigorous, there are no knockdown, universally accepted proofs for any particular stance on God, soul, or the universe's ultimate origin or purpose. Every argument has counter-arguments, refutations, or leaves unanswered questions.
Okay, wow. Let's try and wrap up this particular deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, tackling these immense questions, God, soul, universe, using the lens of the source material, really focusing on that knowing versus believing distinction.
Yeah, we looked at the logical challenge posed by the problem of evil, the surprising variety of ideas about what a soul even is, and the difficulty in answering that fundamental question of why the universe exists at all.
And then we got into how we interpret our own experiences, like with sleep paralysis, same event, totally different meanings depending on your framework, and how you can just enjoy the rhythm of a song.
Which all seems to point towards the idea, strongly suggested by the source and thinkers like Kant, that maybe some of these ultimate questions are just beyond our current capacity to answer with absolute certainty.
And that maybe the most honest and perhaps even the most productive stance is to acknowledge that limitation.
Exactly. Honesty about what we know and what we merely believe or perhaps don't know at all.
So maybe here's something for you, the listener, to chew on. If it turns out that many strongly held beliefs about the biggest questions are actually built on interpretation or faith rather than verifiable fact, how does that change the way you think about information? How you form your own understanding of the world?
Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.